In Tower Defense Simulator, there's been a surprising amount of tower renames, from their planned names upon release to even changes in the names from when they were first leaked. And we start off with the Rocketeer Tower. Now, this wasn't a major rename of the tower, so when released, the Rocketeer Tower was named ROCKET, but only one E and then R. Now, at the time, I didn't really think that this was much of an issue. I just thought that this is the way that Americans spell things, because obviously, Below Natural is an American, I'm English. As an Englishman, I would see this as Rocketeer, you enunciate the ER. It's so that's double E and that's R. So I just thought, well, it's just a weird way of Americans saying or spelling Rocketeer. However, that was not the case, actually. It turns out having double E and then R is actually quite common in America. The one notable word that comes to my mind is racketeering. So there is a whole act about it, the RICO Act, which is spelled out as Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. So it seems like having Rocketeer spelled with only one E seemed to be a linguistic mistake by Below Natural. With that being said though, the official update log does appear to have the Rocketeer name with double ER. Not entirely sure if this is the case, because I do remember the Rocketeer was released with only one E. So this could be Below Natural having a dyslexic moment. I am going to assume that he's dyslexic. He's not confirmed he's dyslexic. In terms of neurodivergency, I think he might be a little bit spicy. I mean, probably all developers are, but that's not a comment on neurodivergency in general. I'm very neurodivergent, let's be honest. But in any case, the Rocketeer would change to its current spelling of double E in the Mega Update. I don't know why it took so long for this to occur, given the fact that most people call it the Rocketeer, not the Rocketeur, since its addition to the game. I guess it also comes down to the way you say it. It's the Rocketeur or Rocketeer. I think most people say Rocketeer, I can't lie. And it seems like the developers agreed with it because they changed it. So that was the first ever rename of a tower, I believe, in Tower Defense Simulator. The next tower is not officially a rename. It was just that when the Hunter was first teased in Tower Defense Simulator, it wasn't teased as the Hunter, it was teased as the Clout God. Now, this was because in August, this was teased as such, and this was called the Clout God. Your inspirations for this, from Below Natural, very clearly Twitter, and you can see where the name Clout God came from, having followers on Twitter. However, the developers got backlash because it was very similar to a tower from Tower Battles, which was considered a major inspiration for Tower Defense Simulator, and having another tower that the game officially stole, not by name, but by near design, would have looked pretty bad on the developers. So they decided to change it into the Hunter Tower. But the blue skin, when it was initially released, looked a lot like the original Clout God Tower. However, that's changed where this version doesn't have like the Twitter branding all over it. I mean, given the fact that Twitter is now called X, having a Twitter tower in the game seems a little bit off now. That being said, though, I still believe there is a Twitter minigun in the game, so... But while this isn't an official rename, it went from Clout God to Hunter before it was either added. For the purposes of this video, let's call it a rename. Because the next tower had one name before it was released, but has now become the most renamed tower in Tower Defense Simulator. That tower is the Slasher. However, when this was first leaked, it was actually called the Chainsaw. Now, yes, back in the day, the Slasher Tower, as we'll call it now, for now at least, did have a chainsaw at max level, which I guess is the inspiration for why you kind of know that the Chainsaw Tower was renamed into the next name that we're going to get along to later. However, in current versions, the chainsaw does not appear. I would very much like there to be a classic skin for the Slasher Tower, which does bring back the chainsaw, but I don't think they will re-add it. Fun fact, this is the version that was teased to us back in the day, alongside the Medic and a unreleased Mine Tower. Oh god, I should probably make a video on this. I yearn for the mines. Anyways, yes, as you can very clearly see, Chainsaw, Tower, Chainsawer, yes. And because this version of the Chainsaw was released before the tower that we'll get to later, many people assumed, and I actually do assume, and actually I kind of do know, that this was the original version of the current modern day Slasher. But here's the fun fact. When the Slasher was first released, it wasn't released as the Chainsaw, no, it was released and more commonly known as the Shredder. I mean, even on the Game Pass, you can see, for the original Shredder Game Pass, you can see that it had a chainsaw, and it looks very similar, actually, to the chainsaw that was leaked previously. So, you can see why, firstly, it was called the Chainsaw before production release, and then when it was released, it was called the Shredder. However, the developers decided, oh wait, let's rename it again. But in the Mega Update, in the Overhaul Update in 2020, the developers really couldn't decide on a name for the Shredder. Why did the Shredder need to get renamed? I don't know. Personally, I think it may be because the Shredder was getting constantly hashtagged by Roblox. I think at some point the Game Pass or the badge for the Shredder Tower was, for some reason, being tagged by Roblox for being inappropriate. Yeah, this is when Roblox moderation tags were like oversensitive, shall we say. Also, there was an argument at the time that the Slasher would have sounded more formal than the Shredder. I don't really think so. I just think the Slasher is the tower name that they agreed upon late into the production, because actually the first tower name that was first teased to us wasn't the Slasher after the Shredder. No, it would have been called the Stabber. I'm from London. I do know of a couple of stabbings in London. Stereotypical, I know. However, I think Stabber is a bit too on the... It is like an accurate description of what the tower does, but I think it's a bit too on the nose and a bit too violent for the game. I don't think Shredder is violent enough to warrant a rename, and I think Slasher is actually sounding more violent than the Shredder. But this Stabber tower name leak was only appearing in the public testing versions of Tower Defense Simulator before the official release. At the official release of Tower Defense Simulator, Shredder Tower would actually be renamed to the Slasher Tower. So while this tower has officially only gone by 2 names, it could have been gone by a whole lot more. And ironically enough, the tower that this was loosely inspired by is called the Knifer from Tower Battles, but it was never planned to be called the Knifer, presumably because I don't think the developers wanted to catch a case of, well, you're copying a tower. Next is another overhaul update rename. That would be to the tower that we call the Ranger right now. When the Ranger was first released, it was actually called the Outlaw Tower, and in fact, the Outlaw Tower is not its full name. Officially, it was called the Space Outlaw Tower. However, for reasons, I assume, to just reduce the name, it was released as the Outlaw Tower officially in the game. Now, the reason why it's called the Space Outlaw, pretty simple. When it was first released, it did have a space aesthetic. So as you can see here, sci-fi goggles and a rifle that is seemingly futuristic, which is kind of a theme with the Outlaw Tower back in the day. We know it's called Space Outlaw because in the update thumbnail for the update at the time, the Outlaw update, it was called Space Outlaw Unit. However, the name for this tower would change in the same update where the Shredder Tower was renamed to the Slasher Tower, the overhaul update. Now, I actually know the official reason for why the Outlaw Tower was renamed into the Ranger Tower. However, I don't think Below Natural has ever made that public, so I can't ever talk about it until he decides to go public with it. I'm not going to give any clues for why the reason is, but we're just going to have to say that. Also, I think Ranger is much more of a descriptive name for this tower than the Outlaw, given the fact that the Ranger was remodeled in the overhaul update to look less like a Outlaw, and without the context of the Space Outlaw for the Ranger skins, you would have not really known why it was called the Outlaw. And I only think that people were peeved by the fact that the Outlaw was renamed to the Ranger Tower because of nostalgia, even in that moment. And people resist change so hard. And I kid you not, for like a year after the Ranger was renamed, people really wanted it to be renamed back into the Outlaw. However, I think those arguments have well died down now, and I'll be surprised if many people know that the Ranger originally was called the Outlaw without reading the TDS Wiki. Think that's the last overhaul update rename? Think again. No, the Archer has also been renamed. When this tower was released in 2019, it was actually called the Holiday Archer. However, in the overhaul update, the developers decided to shorten its name down to the Archer. Now, the reasons for this are a little unclear. However, I would actually think that this is the same reason why, back in the day, the Space Outlaw was never called the Space Outlaw, it was just called the Outlaw. Its common name amongst the community was actually just called the Archer. And the Holiday moniker in front of its name only really applied for the fact that it was released during Christmas 2019. And its skin, back in the day, had an elf hat, which symbolised the holiday. However, once the Archer would get a remodel, it wouldn't look that holiday-y, so I would assume that's the reason why the Archer was renamed from the Holiday Archer. Plus, back in the day, the Archer planned to get different types of arrows, which I don't think really fits the holiday theme. So while it's official renaming, I'm not entirely sure of, that's the best I can speculate, and I think it's pretty close to why it was renamed. However, I don't think that's the most famous rename, and it's not even the last rename in the overhaul update. No, the most major name change was actually to the Militant Tower, because originally this was released as the John Tower, and in fact the John Militant skin is in the game. So, the John Tower was based on the YouTuber known as John Roblox. I'm actually aware, all of a sudden, that he is a famous meme, even though he's a meme because of a laughter that's not even by him, it's by a Brazilian streamer that's actually become a worldwide meme. I don't know how that happened, but John Roblox is known outside of Tower Defense Simulator. However, I think back in the day, he was like one of the first YouTubers to pick up on Tower Defense Simulator because Below Natural was his friend. And so to honour that, there was a tower named after John Roblox called the John Tower, which would boost the damage of towers nearby with a certain ability, similar to how the Commander works now for fire rate. However, in the overhaul update, and pretty late in development I must say, given the fact that the icons still actually refer to this John Tower period, and during hardcore mode testing, it was still called the John Tower and not the Militant Tower. Anyways, even though it was called the John Tower in hardcore testing, this would be renamed to the Militant Tower and would get a complete overhaul in its model in the overhaul update. Now, the reasons for this renaming, I think, is because Below Natural thought that John, as a name for a tower, is a little bit off. Like, you have the scout, you have the soldier, you have the minigunner, then you have John. It is really weird to have a name as part of a roster of towers. And I don't know, it could just be Below Natural just trying to rename the John Tower so that it seemed less influenced by a YouTuber. People have suggested that this is Below Natural trying to cut ties with John Roblox or trying to move away from John Roblox. No, that's not the case, because back in the day, John Roblox made the trailer for the hardcore testing and made previews for hardcore testing as well. And he only started to move away, I guess, from like 2022 and 2023. But certainly, back in 2020 and 2021, John Roblox was still associated with Tower Defense Simulator. So that's not the reason why. I just think it's just Below Natural thinking John was a little bit too out of place in a tower roster. But he would release the John skin anyway, so if you want further proof that Below Natural and John Roblox were like still friends at the time, this is your proof basically. Finally, I want to talk about the Pursuit, because even though it's not gotten an official rename, at certain points in the game's history, it has been referred to as the Helicopter, not the Pursuit. Because when this Game Pass was first released for the Pursuit Tower, it was actually called the Helicopter, not the Pursuit. We do have a record of this, so back in the day, its first name was Helicopter, second name Helicopter with the new tag removed, third name Pursuit, and then the fourth name, I assume this was like a version of like Helicopter or something like that. However, certainly, by the Pursuit rework, it was renamed to the Pursuit Game Pass, because that was the name of the tower. It was never called the Helicopter Tower, it's just that the Game Pass never actually reflected the name until it was renamed to what I assume was the Pursuit for a sale.